So when I finished my basement, I neglected to put any shelving in the basement closet. Our intention was to mainly use it for board games, but I didn't want to put the shelves too high so that the games would be out of reach for kids. But as kids grow up, we didn't want a bunch of low shelves that rendered the closet useless for taller items. We needed some kind of adjustable shelving solution, so I figured I'd put in some Sawtooth shelves. Now, this is not a revolutionary concept. Sawtooth shelves have been around for hundreds of years, but they don't seem to be all that common. The way they work is that there's an adjustable bracket that fits into the notches on the upright, and then each shelf is notched out for the uprights and then rests on top of the brackets. Then to move the shelf higher or lower, simply lift the shelf, move the brackets to the desired height, and then drop the shelf back down on top of them. Well, this ought to be fun. Let's see if we can build this thing. The first thing I do is raid my garage lumber storage. This is mainly just construction grade stuff, but it'll work just fine for the uprights. I managed to dig deep enough and find a 2x10 piece of cedar which is over 7 feet long, and that'll work perfectly. I bring it down to the shop and then manage to also scrounge up 2 more cedar 2x4s that I had lying around. I cleaned them up and got them all to the same thickness by running them through the planer a bunch of times. And then over at the miter saw, I cut each one to their final length of 7 foot. That's exactly 2,133.6 millimeters for all of my metric-loving viewers. I cut off one of the rounded edges on each of the uprights so that I can use that square side as a reference when I cut them to their final width. Look at that little ball of cedar fuzz. It's like a cedar-scented clump of Carrot Top's afro. And just like his career, there it goes. I set the fence to 3 inches and then went ahead and I cut down all the uprights to their final widths. Next up is drawing out all the sawtooth notches on just one of the uprights. I used my combination square along with the scribe so that my pencil tip wouldn't wander away from the point. But after marking out about 1 billion of these things, I got the hang of it and I didn't need the scribe anymore. So I figured the easiest way to cut all these would be to just cut them all together. So I put the one I marked out in front, and then I put the other 3 just behind it. I flushed up the ends with a speed square, and then I threw a few clamps on it. At this point, I could use some regular old blue painter's tape and lash all 4 boards together. I went for the Smurf barber pole look, not just because it was fun and it looks neat, but because I had to be careful not to double up the tape anywhere because that would knock me out of square when I put this against the fence for the cuts. Then was over to the miter saw. Since the marks were on the front, I had to kneel down to line things up for every cut, and it didn't take long before I had to go get my wife's gardening cushions so that I wouldn't hurt my little princess knees while I was kneeling on the concrete. I'm sure I lose a man point for that, but oh well. At least I hit it from the camera and you didn't see the color of the cushion. It was pink. I then tipped the miter saw to the side and I locked it in for a 45-degree bevel cut. These cuts were a lot easier since I could line things up from the top. You may have noticed that I have 2 sacrificial boards behind the uprights. Those were just to hold the project pieces away from the fence so that the blade could reach its maximum depth throughout the full cut. Otherwise, since I'm using a depth stop, the cuts would come out curved, and that would be no bueno. After all the cuts were done, I used a pull saw to clean up the inside of the cuts. Now, they don't need to be perfect here. We're not building a church, so don't waste too much time trying to get these things pristine. I could now undo all the tape and free these guys up from their bonds. And then next, I ran them all over the table saw again to cut off the tips of each of the teeth, just to make them a little less mean looking. Then after a quick sanding of all 4 of them, I was ready for color. I gooped on 2 coats of white paint so that they would blend into the closet walls. This was actually quite a lengthy process. It took me well over an hour to paint these 4 boards. Thank goodness for Pandora, otherwise I would have lost my mind. Next, I put Lance Bass and Lou Ferrigno's initials on 2 of the uprights, and then I could take them over to the closet for mounting. I start by drilling some holes through the uprights and into the drywall. Then I widen those holes in the drywall and I pound in some anchors. And then screw the uprights in. Make sure the screws are flush to the surface though, so that the shelves won't get hung up on them. Now for the brackets. I cut an old stair tread into strips, glued a couple of them together to get the right thickness, clamped them up for a bit, and when they were dry I flattened the bottom on the jointer. I ripped them to their final size on the table saw and then cut 45s on the ends over at the miter saw. Next, I cut a bunch of long strips out of 2x4s to use as face boards on each of the shelves. This will not only be more aesthetically pleasing to the eye, but it'll add much more stability to the shelves and keep them from bowing. I got some maple plywood for the shelf surfaces and I cut that down to size. And then I cut it to its final width over at the miter saw. Each piece of plywood had a small bow to it already, so naturally I used a small child to weigh it down. If you don't have a small child, you can borrow one, just make sure you get permission, otherwise there might be an undesirable outcome. Now it's time to put on some glue and attach the shelf faces. After spreading it out and lining things up, I could pop in a few nails to hold things in place. And then I put on several clamps just to make sure things were tight. Once dry, I used a hand plane to smooth out any areas where the shelf faces weren't flush with the surface. Now I'm marking out the areas where the shelves need to be notched out for the uprights, and then the bandsaw makes short work of cutting these out. If you do the interweb picture thingy and you're enjoying the video so far, then follow me on Instagram. I promise not to inundate you with high quality pictures of my dog. They'll be low quality pictures. After breaking the sharp corners with a block plane, the shelves are ready for a couple coats to be rolled on. And after painting each of the brackets, they seem to find their own way to the closet all by themselves. So I just put the brackets in at whatever height I want and drop each shelf in on top of them. And then I'm ready to load up the closet with all the board games. And there you have it, Sawtooth Shelves. It's quite a bit of work up front, but it sure makes for a very versatile shelving solution. What's nice is that you can change the height or add and remove shelves, and there's no leftover marks or holes in the walls. Hey, if you liked the video, please help me out and click that thumbs up button. Leave me a comment below and consider subscribing. There's a lot more cool projects and some lame jokes to come. And if you'd like to build these shelves, I'll leave links to my SketchUp drawing as well as some two-dimensional plans in the video description. And that's it for this one. Take it easy, folks.
Oh, man. Ew. That one's too small. That one's too big. Nice going, you moron. The roller does, after all this setup, and the roller doesn't even fit in the tray. Oh my gosh, I'm so dumb.
Sweet job marking up the wall. That was awesome.